by for the Northern Alliance Radio Network. And go launch sequence. Engineering?
Go flight.
Master control?
Go flight.
Studio engineer?
Go flight.
We are go for launch in T-minus 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
The Northern Alliance Radio Network is on the air. Live and local from the AM 1280 The Patriot Studios in Eagan, here is the closer, Brad Carlson.
Well, this is becoming old hat at this point. You know, there was a period of time I had a show on a rival station for 3 years back in the day in the evenings. And the funny thing is I left that in 2019. And I remember telling people we had like an end of the show party, had, guests and friends come hang out to kind of celebrate my retirement from the airwaves. And I remember telling them, I feel like I've kind of said everything there's to say. I feel like I've exhausted everything that I have to say about every topic. And then COVID happened. And the rest is history. AM 1280, The Patriot, the Northern Alliance Radio Network. My name is Walter Hudson, sitting in for Brad Carlson, which I am honored to do. I'll be doing it again next week as well. So if you like what you hear today, be sure to tune in next week. And of course, you should be tuning in all the time because Brad is great and the entire NARN team is great. You can join the conversation at 651-289-4488. You can find us at am1280thepatriot.com. Intelligent radio. That's what we like to say around here. We're talking intelligently. And that actually is the focus of today's program, is I want to apply a little bit of intellect to the current political moment. Last week, I was filling in for Mitch Berg on Saturday, and we spent a lot of time reacting to the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the abhorrent things that were being said by a number of prominent Democrats, including some of my legislative colleagues in the House of Representatives and the state Senate and the governor and former President Barack Obama. Like, the list just goes on and on and on of the prominent Democrats who are saying absolutely abhorrent things about a innocent Christian husband and father who just wanted to debate people who he disagreed with and got shot in the throat for his trouble. And before his wife could even place him in his grave, Democrats were dancing in it. We talked about that last week. A few things have happened between then and now. The conversation has not calmed down. The temperature has not been lowered. If anything, it's continuing to be ratcheted up. We've seen a number of acts of violence throughout the country, ICE facilities coming under attack. Just this morning, there was apparently in Michigan, a mass shooting at a Mormon church in Michigan. Those facts are still coming in. Obviously, an ongoing investigation. We have not, to my knowledge, I've been tracking it, but it's real time. So to my knowledge, we have not identified who the perpetrator is. We don't know what their motivation may or may not have been, but we can take some guesses, right? At this point, you can credibly assume, like, you can look at the odds, just like you would on a poker hand, and say, this one's probably a winner. I should probably push my chips in on this one. Just looking at the board, looking at the cards that are on the board, looking at what I got in my hand, the odds are I'm right on this one. And that's kind of how I feel about this shooting in Michigan that took place today, is that when the facts finally do come out, I probably won't be disappointed by the revelations of who it was and what they were motivated by. So this is the environment that we're in, right? One where there is this consistent, persistent violence that's taking place on an almost daily basis. It seems like we can't go through another day without another act of leftist violence taking place in the state of Minnesota and across the nation. And in that environment, you would think that people looking at that across the political spectrum would say, you know what, we got it. You would think that they'd be saying what they were saying back in June in the aftermath of the assassination of my colleague, Speaker Emeritus Melissa Hortman, and her husband, Mark, and the shootings of Senator Hoffman and his wife. You would think that the conversation would sound a little bit like that, where everybody was saying, oh, this is terrible. We can't have this. Political violence is categorically off the table. We need to tone down the rhetoric. We need to bring down the temperature. We need to figure out new ways to talk to each other. My God, what's going on? You would think that that would be the narrative, but it's not. Instead, we're doubling down on, we're seeing Democrats in particular and leftists, and again, prominent Democrats. We're going to talk about Gavin Newsome today, the governor of the largest state in the union, population-wise, I believe. Doubling down on the fascistic rhetoric, doubling down on calling his political opponents fascists. Fascists, they say. So I want to apply a little bit of intellect to analyzing that claim. What do you think? Are you a fascist? Is the Republican Party a party of fascists? Has fascism taken over the United States? Is Donald Trump a fascist dictator? Do we advocate, do conservatives like Charlie Kirk advocate for fascism? Now, for most people listening to this air, that's probably a categorically absurd question, that whole line of questioning. We just dismiss it out of hand as categorically absurd, and we, as a result, don't engage with the claim because it's so absurd. It's so obviously an exaggeration, hyperbole, and inciting that we think to ourselves, well, we don't need to engage with this argument because it's clearly false and beyond the pale. And the average person out there who hears those claims is going to react the same way that we do. They're going to be like, that's absurd, that's ridiculous, this is not something that is a legitimate form of political discourse. But let me suggest to you that we absolutely must engage with this argument. We absolutely must engage with these accusations, because when you have governors of states, including our own, Governor Tim Walz, who is engaged in this rhetoric routinely, calling Republicans fascists, saying that we're white supremacists and what have you, if they're comfortable doing that, like none of these people do these things without a political angle. And the fact that they're comfortable saying these things out loud, that they're posting and then doubling down and then going to the next rally and saying it again, and then getting on cable news and saying it again. The fact that they're willing to do that tells you that they have calculated that this is a winning political strategy, which means that they've calculated that people are actually going to take it seriously, that they're going to agree with them, and that it's going to result in future electoral victories. So, absurd though the claim may be, and as obviously as all of us look at it and say this is utter and complete nonsense and not something that should be taken seriously, we do have to take it seriously. We do have to engage with it. So let me just kind of walk you through some of my thought process on this, because there's a few things that I notice. First of all, there's this moral equivocation that seems to take place where we complain or we object to being labeled fascists, and the other side will say something along the lines, and I've engaged with this stuff on my social media. You can check out my ex at Walter Hudson. The other side will say things like, well, you call us communists. you call us socialists. If calling you fascist is inciting, then so is that. Well, forgive me, but there's a couple of fairly obvious distinctions between those two things. Number one, you're not going to find self-identifying fascists within the Republican Party. Okay? There is no fascist Republicans of America organization that's out there endorsing candidates and getting them elected. There is, however, a Democrat Socialists of America organization that's out there that has something in the zone of 200 plus elected officials across the country, including about a dozen or so in our own state, between the Minneapolis City Council and the state legislature. So that's a pretty significant difference, right? Like if you're going to equate me identifying you and your party as socialist versus you accusing us of being fascist, I can point to people in your party who actually embrace the term socialist proudly and are campaigning on it. Probably the biggest example right now would be Zoran Memdani, trying to be the mayor of New York. He is a DSA member, Democrat Socialists of America member. He's openly campaigning as a socialist. And how's the response been from the Democrat Party? Have they said, "Oh, that's come on now, that's outside of bounds. That's a bridge too far. We're not going to be part of that"? No. In fact, current DNC chair Ken Martin, who you may recall as the former DFL chair here in Minnesota, so he was in charge of Democrats here in the state, now he's in charge of Democrats everywhere in the nation, went on one of these cable news programs and was specifically asked, "What do you think about Zoran Memdani? Is he part of your big tent?" And he said unequivocally, "Yes, of course, we're a big tent. We don't all agree on everything, but by God, these folks are included in our coalition." Now, Dean Phillips, to his credit, pushed back on that and said, "Are you kidding me? No. The Zoran Memdanis amongst us should not be part of our big tent." But Dean Phillips is a minority voice in his party. He's an outcast. He's in exile. The establishment forces within the Democrat Party fully embrace these socialists. Where's the analog to that in the Republican Party? Can you point me to, like, has the RNC chair ever came out and said, "Well, I don't necessarily agree with these fascists out there openly organizing as fascists, but we're a big tent, and so, the fascists have a place somewhere at our table"? Yeah, you're not going to find that because it's never happened. You're also not going to find that because there is no significant political organization operating under the auspices of fascism, out in the open, claiming it as a label for themselves, saying, "Yep, we're fascists. We love fascism. Fascism's great. Fascism's the future of the country, and we're organizing to elect fascist candidates." That organization simply does not exist. And it's certainly not embraced by the Republican Party. So that's a pretty significant difference. And that's one of two ways that you can identify whether or not somebody actually is aligned with a particular ideology. The first one being that they declare it openly, that they say, "This is what I am. I am a socialist." Okay, well, I'm going to take you at your word. When you tell me that you're a socialist, when you're endorsed by the Democrat Socialists of America, I'm going to accept at face value that you mean what you say, that you're actually organized to affect what your organization says you're organized to affect. Now, the other way you can identify, because sometimes people aren't open about their beliefs, right? Sometimes people aren't open about their ideology. And I think that this is the premise upon which the Democrats are operating, is like right now, if one of them were to call in 651-289-4488, they would probably say something to the effect of, "Well, yeah, Walter, but, we don't expect you guys to admit that you're fascists, but you shall know them by their fruits. Look at what you do. Look at what you advocate for. And look at how that aligns with the definition of fascism. That's how we know you're fascists." Well, is that true? We'll examine it when we come back. 651-289-4488. AM 1280, The Patriot. Walter Hudson sitting in for Brad Carlson.
Why I feel this way about our love and what I must do.
Find yourself stuck on the side of the road or slipping and sliding as you drive along? Well, it might be time to look into getting new tires. Check out TireGit.com. We're talking about a conservative-owned Minnesota business that provides top-notch customer service. They'll deliver your new tires to the vendor of your choice for installation and take care of you from beginning to end. Use promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, to get 3% off their already remarkable low prices. That's promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, at TireGit.com. But no, it was Superman 2. That's where I heard this for the first time. AM 1280, The Patriot, the Northern Alliance Radio Network. My name is Walter Hudson, sitting in for Brad Carlson on this Sunday. You can join the conversation at 651-289-4488. Intelligent Radio. So we're talking about these accusations that everyone is making on the left regarding Republicans and the Trump administration and conservatives more generally, that we're all a bunch of fascists. And I spent the first segment pointing out the very obvious and I think particularly impactful observation that, you know, when they compare us calling them socialists to them calling us fascists, we have a one-up on them, and that is the fact that they literally claim it. They claim it. They have entire organizations dedicated to implementing socialism in the United States. Some of them even go so far as to call themselves communists. We just elected one last week. Special election to fill Hortman's seat. They elected a avowed communist who, by the way, who posted 8647 on social media. Direct call for violence, direct call for the assassination of Donald Trump. It's another one of my colleagues. I get to share space with him. I get to debate that guy. All right. So that's what they're bringing to the table. And there's no analog for that on the right. There's no analog for that in the Republican Party. You don't have people walking around saying, yep, I'm a fascist. I'm here to affect fascism in the United States. Like, that's not happening. So the alternative, because they have to acknowledge that, right? Like, you can't, there's no arguing that. It's just objectively true. So the next argument that they'll shift to is, well, we don't expect you guys to admit that you're fascists, but you're acting like them. You'll get comments like this. So there's this whole flare up right now online regarding Governor Gavin Newsome out of California going after Stephen Miller, who's part of the Trump administration, calling him a fascist. And he tweeted, I should bring up this tweet. I got it printed out at the moment. But he says, textbook definition of a fascist. And that's in reference to, you know, people objecting to his characterization of Stephen Miller as a fascist. And so the idea there is, well, yeah, you know, of course, Stephen Miller doesn't claim to be a fascist, but he's acting like one. Here it is. So this is the definition of fascism that Gavin Newsome put on X just 22 hours ago. An authoritarian far-right political ideology defined by a dictatorial leader, aggressive nationalism, suppression of opposition, and tight control over all aspects of society. Okay. And then he has like a checkbox of how Trump and Miller check all those boxes. Well, there's a number of problems with that definition. First of all, it's way too vague, way too broad, doesn't actually get to the heart of what defines a fascist. I mean, by that definition, you're talking about literally any totalitarian regime. Any totalitarian regime of any stripe, including socialism and communism, would fit into that definition. But the first mistake in this definition is the categorization of it being far right. And we talked about this last week. This political spectrum that we operate under and have our public discourse in, where we refer to the right and the left, is a complete and total construct. It's made up. It's invented. It's a mental framework for trying to process expressed ideologies. And as we discussed last week, when I was filling in for Mitch Berg, it doesn't serve us well. Talking about fascism as far right, what that implies is that if you go far enough along down the path of being a conservative, you end up becoming a fascist. But that's categorically ridiculous. Because what does it mean to be a conservative? Well, in the modern parlance, a conservative is actually a classical liberal. See, we forget this. We live in what is called a liberal democracy, and that is not an ideological term. That is a clinical term for how our government operates and how our society operates. A classical liberal society values things like free speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, individual rights, property rights, rule of law. So you need to explain to me how you can go too far down that path and somehow end up a fascist, right? Like it just doesn't work, right? Like my goal, my endeavor is to pursue maximal civil liberties and freedom to associate, freedom to speak, freedom to express yourself, freedom to worship. And if I pursue that long and hard enough, I become a fascist. That makes no logical sense whatsoever. So why do we call it far right? Why do people continue, and people on our side do it too, why do we continue to refer to fascism as far right when it actually has nothing whatsoever to do with anything else that is categorized as right wing? Nothing whatsoever. The actual political spectrum, and I say this again, the actual political spectrum is on one end that classical liberalism, that liberal democratic republic, that constitutional republic, what our founding fathers gifted us. Ben Franklin said, "You have a republic if you can keep it." That's one side of the spectrum. And on the other side, the way, way far other side, the other pole, is totalitarianism in all of its forms. Socialism, communism, fascism, theocracy, all of it. Anything that denies those freedoms, anything that denies the rule of law, anything that says one guy or an oligarchy is in charge and the rest of y'all are subjects, monarchy, all of that stuff is on the other end of the spectrum. So if you want to call the side that we're on right and the other side left, fine, whatever. You can call it up, down, left, right, backwards, forwards, inside out, like whatever. You can call it whatever you want. The fact of the matter is, the side that we're on is fundamentally opposed to all of those totalitarian ideologies. And so that's the first problem with this definition of fascism that Gavin Newsome puts forward, is identifying it as quote unquote far right. That is a fallacy that's rooted in a obfuscation that is our current accepted political spectrum. And then he goes on to say dictatorial leader, dictatorial. Interesting. Interesting on a couple of fronts. First of all, what has Trump or Miller dictated? How have they acted outside of the law? Can you provide me a list? What are they doing that they don't have congressional or constitutional authority to do? Specifically in the context of, because all of this this conversation is spawned over the announcement that Trump is going to send federal troops into Portland to combat Antifa and other violent left-wing organizations, whether formal or informal, that have been organizing violence directed at ICE offices and other folks, that's somehow dictatorial to do that. That it's dictatorial and aggressive. It's a suppression of free speech to not let people shoot at buildings. Like we had a guy who was on top of a roof, I think this was down in Texas, so eager to take out ICE agents that instead he ended up shooting detainees. All right. You're telling me it's dictatorial to react to that with law enforcement? It's dictatorial to send in the troops to stop that from happening? We got people trying to set ICE facilities on fire and assault ICE agents, federal agents. These are federal law enforcement officers. You're saying it's dictatorial to protect your federal agents? That's dictatorial. Interesting. And it's particularly interesting in a context where, we just spent the past several years, since 2020, enduring real dictatorial behavior, primarily, overwhelmingly, from Democrat executives, whether governors or President Joe Biden. You remember being locked in your house? You remember having your business shut down? You remember having your kids' education permanently thwarted and degraded by being kept out of school, all while, Target, Walmart, and Tim Walz's personal friend who owns the largest candy store in Minnesota got to stay in business. You remember that? Seems a little dictatorial to me. 651-289-4488, AM 1280, The Patriot. My name's Walter Hudson, sitting in for Brad Carlson. The world today demands eternal vigilance. That's why we need to take care of our businesses, our families, our communities with security services. Integris Risk Solutions is a fantastic company that provides former law enforcement officers and former military personnel who are highly trained in order to provide the top-notch security services necessary for your business, your HOA, your school. They're adaptable to any situation. Check them out today.
Our agents receive extra training over, way and above the state minimum standards in order to be able to respond to any issues and be able to handle all situations.
Contact W. Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com or call 763-445-9482 to set up your free consultation today. That's 763-445-9482 or W. Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com. AM 1280, The Patriot, the Northern Alliance Radio Network. We do intelligent radio here. We're doing a deep dive into an analysis of the claim that Republicans and conservatives, and certainly this current administration under President Trump, holy smokes, they're fascists. It's all fascist. And by the way, when we say that, when we call you a fascist, by God, we're not actually calling for violence. This isn't stochastic terrorism. Well, we're just calling it as we see it. Are they, though? My name's Walter Hudson, filling in for Brad Carlson. 651-289-4488 is the number to join us. Let's go to Mike in Minneapolis. Thanks for holding over the break.
Hi, Walter. Yeah, I just you stole a little bit of my thunder with some of the stuff that Walz did as governor. Yeah, I noticed years ago that he and many other Democratic governors were acting like fascists. They were using the power of the government to shut down businesses. He wanted a shadow government that he mentioned on MSNBC. And isn't it true that Mussolini was part of the Socialist Party in Italy as well as Hitler? I don't know why conservatives are so afraid to throw that label back in Democrats' faces.
Well, I don't know why. I mean, it was called the National Socialist Party, right? I mean, that's what Nazi means. That's what it's a short term, a nickname for, National Socialist. So yes, indeed, as I was saying earlier, all this stuff should properly be placed on one far end of the political spectrum, and it's exactly the opposite end of the spectrum that the rest of us are on. I appreciate you calling in, Mike. Appreciate the commentary. So yeah, this is fascinating. It's an absolutely fascinating phenomenon that we're living through here, where we're being called fascists by people who themselves have engaged in fascistic activity and advocated for fascistic policy. And again, like, these distinctions between socialism, fascism, communism, whatever you want to call it, past a certain point, they almost become meaningless. Because in essence, what they all have in common is you don't get to be you. You don't get to live your life according to your values. You're not free to say what you believe. You're not free to associate as you see fit. You're not free to keep your property and to dispose of it as you please. Those are common tenets of all of those ideologies: fascism, socialism, communism. And so I'm not sure how much we benefit from the navel-gazing exercise of trying to distinguish between them. They're all un-American. They're all undermining the American project. And they all have no place, and should have no place, in our public discourse, certainly in our institutions, and certainly amongst our elected officials. Yet, unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit about this claim, this kind of like plausible deniability that the folks who are engaged in this rhetoric, calling Republicans fascist, calling Trump fascist, calling Stephen Miller fascist, what it is that they're trying to paper themselves over with in terms of an excuse for why it's okay to engage in this rhetoric. And it's interesting because I didn't come up with this term. This is a term that was being bandied about quite frequently by the left over the past few years. But there's something called stochastic terrorism. Stochastic terrorism. And the idea is, I'm going to try to pull up the actual definition here. But in basic terms, in my own words, basically what it means is where you yourself don't engage in the violence, but through your rhetoric, you create what Ben Shapiro calls the permission structure, and you incite other people to engage in violence. So the definition that popped up when I just stuck it in right now is stochastic terrorism occurs when influential speakers use hostile rhetorical attacks against groups or individuals, fostering a climate of fear and increasing the likelihood of statistically unpredictable violent acts by others, while the speakers remain insulated from direct legal responsibility due to the subtle nature of their rhetoric and First Amendment protections. All right? That's the definition. And that's what we're seeing happening with this deployment of the term fascism. In fact, that what we talked about last segment, Governor Gavin Newsome putting out that definition, that ridiculous and inaccurate and inadequate definition of fascism, and applying it to Trump and Stephen Miller. I asked Grok, you can click the little Grok symbol on any given post and it will give you an analysis of that post. I didn't prompt it at all. I didn't ask any questions. I just clicked on the button, automatically analyze this post. And without me saying anything, without me providing any sort of feedback whatsoever, this is what Grok had to say. This approach mirrors historical instances of stochastic terrorism, a concept supported by a 2017 Columbia University Press study on lone wolf attacks, where vague but incendiary rhetoric from leaders correlates with unpredictable violence as seen in various incidents. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. And what the folks who are engaged in this rhetoric will say is they'll be like, well, listen, yes, I'm calling you a fascist, but I'm against political violence. I'm not calling for violence. I'm just calling it as I see it. I see a fascist, I point and I say, there's a fascist. Well, that's interesting. Setting aside the fact that the people that they're accusing of fascism are in fact not fascists, let's just set that aside. What is supposed to be done with fascists? How are we supposed to react to fascists? We fought an entire war, a world war, against fascism and against fascists. And the ones who we didn't take out on the battlefield, we hanged after the war. We put them on trial and we executed them. That's what we did. So that would seem to be the thing you do with fascists, right? The thing you do with fascists is you kill them. That's how the United States handled it back in the day. So this claim that, well, I'm calling you a fascist, but I'm not actually calling for violence. It's a little bit like saying, well, yeah, I'm calling you a murderer, but I'm not saying you should be arrested. Of course you are, right? Because that's what happens to murderers. It's completely incoherent. If you're going to accuse somebody of being something that requires a particular response, then you can't then claim that you're not advocating for that response. Am I alone on this? 651-689 or 289-4488, 651-289-4488. If you call somebody a fascist, what you're saying is that they present an existential threat to American society. They present an existential threat, and we've heard this rhetoric, right? Threat to democracy, right? For the past several years, we've heard this. Trump's a threat to democracy. Republicans are a threat to democracy. Well, what are you supposed to do with a threat to democracy? Just tolerate it? Argue against it? Debate it? Invite it for dinner? Like, is that what you're supposed to do? with a threat to our Democrat Republic? No. At the very least, you're calling for that person to be removed from ordered society. At the very least. And of course, the most effective and extreme way of doing that is to end their life. And so when we see time after time after time again, these assassins engaging in the targeting of people like Charlie Kirk, and then we see their shell casings and their bullets, and they're inscribed with Antifa terminology. Phrases like, catch this fascist, right? We saw the day after Charlie Kirk was shot on college campuses across the country, you saw this graphic of, it was a drawing depiction of Kirk bleeding from the throat, and underneath it said, debate this. Yeah, well, that's kind of how, I mean, if Charlie Kirk was actually a fascist, like if he was actually a Nazi, that makes a certain degree of sense, right? Like, how can you argue with that? If the guy's advocating for the abolition of the classical liberal order, if he's arguing for the dismantling of the United States, if he's arguing for depriving Americans of their civil rights across the board and submission to a tyrannical, totalitarian authority, and he's actively organizing in order to effect that, if he is in fact a fascist, well then what's wrong with what happened on September 10th? How can you say that was wrong if that's what he was doing? This is what the left needs to unwind, and we need to force them to unwind it. You can't have it both ways. You can't both say that the majority of people who voted in the last election in 2024 for Donald Trump, that the majority of your fellow Americans are a bunch of fascists, and we should just peacefully coexist with them. That dog don't hunt. And yet that's quite literally the premise that they're trying to get away with right now by walking back their stochastic terrorism. Meanwhile, we have this very same people leveling these accusations, actively and explicitly celebrating real terrorists, real violence. This came out of Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union. They put out a post saying, "Rest in power, rest in peace, Assata Shakur. Today we honor the life and legacy of a revolutionary fighter, a fierce writer, a revered elder of black liberation, and a leader of freedom whose spirit continues to live in our struggle." As Chicago teachers, apparently Chicago teachers are involved in some sort of struggle. What struggle in particular are they expressing solidarity for, and what are they honoring this Assata Shakur for having done with her life? Well, she was convicted of the murder of a New Jersey state trooper, along with several other violent crimes. She was broken out of prison by leftist militants and smuggled into Cuba, and she was placed on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. And by the way, one of my legislative colleagues, State Senator Aaron May Quaid, joined in on this honoring, this celebration, this lifting up of a convicted cop killer who was designated by our own FBI as a terrorist. You're going to do that and then turn around and tell me you're not calling for violence? You're going to do that and then pretend that you have some sort of moral high ground? 651-289-4488. AM 1280, The Patriot. My name's Walter Hudson, sitting in for Brad Carlson. Intelligent Radio. Join us on the other side. Find yourself stuck on the side of the road or slipping and sliding as you drive along? Well, it might be time to look into getting new tires. Check out TireGit.com. We're talking about a conservative-owned Minnesota business that provides top-notch customer service. They'll deliver your new tires to the vendor of your choice for installation and take care of you from beginning to end. Use promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, to get 3% off their already remarkable low prices. That's promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, at TireGit.com.
Never quotes him. All of these people going on and on about someone being Hitlerian, but they never quote him. I'm going to quote from a Hitler speech. This is from the Toland biography of Hitler, which is the definitive biography in the English language. So here is Adolf. May the 1st, May Day speech he says, quote, "We are socialists. We are enemies of the capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance, and we are determined to destroy the system under all conditions." Now, does that sound more like Donald Trump or Zoran Mandani? I put it to you.
Point very well made, Dan. I appreciate you calling in to share that with us. Indeed. Right? I mean, and again, anybody, I don't care how you categorize it or how you brand it, anybody who's against the classical liberal order, anybody who's against individual rights, property rights, your capacity to live your life according to your own values, I don't care if you want to label them socialist, fascist, Nazi, communist, comrade, whatever. They're all in the same bucket. They all want to end the American project. They are all functionally traitors. They are engaged in a project of treason to what this country represents. And many of them, because they're in elected office, have taken oaths to the very Constitution that they would throw in the garbage, the very Constitution that they want to dismantle. I mean, here in Minnesota, and I'll get to Bob from Shoreview here momentarily, but here in Minnesota, last year, 2024, under the Democrat trifecta, they made an attempt that was thankfully thwarted by the grace of God to place a ballot question on next year's ballot that, if it had passed, would have amended the state constitution to effectively neuter it completely, to throw it in the trash can. They called it the Equal Rights Amendment. And they always use this Orwellian language. What it actually would have affected is precisely the opposite. What it would have done is it would have codified in the Constitution of the state of Minnesota concepts like gender identity and disparate impact. So past that point, there is no freedom of religion. There is no freedom of association. There is no free speech, right? Because you constitutionally, you must adhere to this concept that contradicts physical reality in terms of this gender ideology. But even worse, the implementation of this disparate impact nonsense, what it would have done is it would have created a judicial framework whereby literally anybody, for literally any reason, perceived or actual, that was the actual language in the bill, perceived or actual discrimination, could bring a lawsuit against anyone, the state, you as an individual, your company, your school district, because you perceive that you're being treated in a discriminatory fashion and that there are disparate impacts upon you or your people group. And what that would have translated to is you would no longer need a legislature. What's the point? What's the point in passing laws when any law that gets passed, all you got to do is conjure some statistical premise that it has disparate impact, and then you can go to a tyrant in a black robe and they can overturn it. That's what the Democrats were pursuing last year, undermining the classical liberal order, undermining all of our constitutional rights, using our very Constitution here in the state as an instrument to undermine what the Constitution represents. You'll forgive me if I don't respond to that by taking your claims of us being fascists in good faith. Let's go to Bob in Shoreview.
Hi, Walter. A little bit of history here. Most informed people know that Nazi is the abbreviation for National Socialist Party. So Russia was also socialist but they had a different variety of socialism. They had global or worldwide aims for socialism, whereas Germany was national socialism. And there's a problem. Germans hated Jews, and Karl Marx was the one that kind of invented communism. So they had their own variety. And you're right, it's not all that cut and dried. There's variations of socialism. And just the fact that Italy, under Mussolini, allied with Russia, it just shows you that fascist tyrants, and socialist tyrants, they're going to unite. They're going to be allies. And another thing is, history tells us that socialism is always associated with mass killing of millions of political opponents, starvation, poverty. So the Democrats naturally want to distance themselves. They don't want it revealed that they're socialists. And, I believe that kind of underlies all of this. What do you think?
Well, and increasingly, they're completely shameless about it. I mean, Zoran Memdani is out there. I mean, like I say, we've got multiple elected legislators, my colleagues, people who I share space with at the state capitol in St. Paul, who have been endorsed by the Democrat Socialists of America. You got Zoran Memdani out there openly saying, yep, I'm a socialist. I want to bring socialism to New York City. I want to put the grocery stores under city control. I appreciate the call, Bob. Yeah, I mean, they're not ashamed of it anymore. They used to be. They used to shy away from it. They used to try to engage in these pedantic distinctions between what socialism is and what they're advocating for. But they've given that up. They don't care about that anymore. They're proceeding with total confidence that they can get away with undermining the classical liberal order with no consequence. 651-289-4488, AM 1280, The Patriot. My name is Walter Hudson, filling in for Brad Carlson. The world today demands eternal vigilance. That's why we need to take care of our businesses, our families, our communities with security services. Integris Risk Solutions is a fantastic company that provides former law enforcement officers and former military personnel who are highly trained in order to provide the top-notch security services necessary for your business, your HOA, your school. They're adaptable to any situation. Check them out today.
Our agents receive extra training over, way, and above the state minimum standards in order to be able to respond to any issues and be able to handle all situations.
Contact W. Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com or call 763-445-9482 to set up your free consultation today. That's 763-445-9482 or W. Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com. Went it wrong, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, you can't tell over the radio, and if you haven't encountered me before, I just so happen to be black. I don't recall there being a whole lot of black fascists running around in Nazi Germany, but I don't know. I mean, I did see that one Key and Peele episode, so maybe I'm wrong about that. Who knows? 651-289-4488 is the number to join us. So as you heard at the top of the hour news break there, and as I mentioned last hour, there was a shooting in Michigan at a church, Mormon church, LDS. This is the latest from Daily Wire. At least one person has died, and approximately 9 people are injured after a shooting at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan, according to police. The shooter, quote, drove his vehicle through the front doors of the church before opening fire, according to Grand Blanc Township Police Chief William Reen. The suspect was later killed in a firefight with police. The current status of the injured victims is unknown. The church fire was likely started by the shooter, according to Police Chief Reen. And so the after the shooting, the guy apparently set the place on fire, and from what I can tell, it burned to the ground. President Donald Trump released a statement on the shooting and fire, saying that he has been briefed and to pray for the victims and their families. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino said in a post on X that FBI agents are responding to the shooting to provide any requested support necessary. Attorney General Pam Bondi posted that she's receiving briefings about what appears to be a horrific shooting and fire at an LDS church in Grand Blanc, Michigan. She also noted that federal agents with the FBI and ATF are responding. Such violence at a place of worship is heartbreaking and chilling. Please join me in praying for the victims of this terrible tragedy, said Bondi. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer responded to the news of the shooting on X, saying, "My heart is breaking for the Grand Blanc community. Violence anywhere, especially in a place of worship, is unacceptable. I am grateful to the first responders who took action quickly. We will continue to monitor this situation and hold the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc close." I have a hard time taking Whitmer seriously when she says violence anywhere is unacceptable. And the reason why I have a hard time taking her seriously when she says that is because she is part of a political party that has just spent the last 2+ weeks celebrating the violence inflicted upon Charlie Kirk. And again, I don't want to hear about how, oh, no, all we're doing is talking about what a terrible person he was in the immediate aftermath of him being shot in the throat in front of the entire nation, including his family and children. That's all we're doing. Is just being really, really super duper honest about what a horrendous person he was. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is, it's not true. Like, the things they're saying about Charlie Kirk objectively, fundamentally, factually are incorrect. Their moral assessment of the type of person he was is incorrect. That's the first problem. The second problem is there's this thing called taste. There's this thing called grace in the immediate aftermath of somebody losing their husband, somebody losing their father. And it was very closely policed back in June after the Hortman murders. Very closely policed. And by the way, not just policed by leftists and by the Democrats and by the legacy media, but also by us, by Republicans. I myself was out there shutting down misinformation, condemning abhorrent expressions of what a terrible person people thought Melissa Hortman was in the immediate aftermath of that incident. Why? Why? Is it because there was nothing negative to say about Melissa Hortman? Is it because there was no legitimate objective criticism I could have possibly made in the immediate hours and days after that horrific event? Is it because there isn't a book to be written about the ways in which she manipulated the legislative process in order to do things that were explicitly unconstitutional, violated our legislative rules of order? I mean, she oversaw the passage of a 1,400-page omnibus bill at the end of last session that was not only unconstitutional, but literally broke, the way they pushed it through, shoved it through, broke every single rule we have in the legislature. Every single one. Now, I could have spent the immediate hours and days after her murder pointing all of that out and then qualifying it by saying, I'm not saying she deserved this, but by God, let's remember all of the things she did that weren't up and up. Had I done that, had any elected Republican or prominent conservative done that, they would have been rightfully condemned for picking that moment to make those statements. And we all know it. So that's the primary issue here, is even if you want to quibble about what kind of a person Charlie Kirk was, you want to quibble about, the moral standing of conservatives generally and Republicans generally, that's fine. We can have that conversation. The time to have it is not after somebody has been brutally murdered on national television, streamed to the entire world. And that should not be a controversial statement. This is what we talked about last week when I was filling in for Mitch Berg about how it's very clear at this point that the social contract has been amended. The social contract being those things which we properly ought to be able to take for granted. It's not written down anywhere. It's just, we just all know it. We all understand it. It's part of our upbringing. It's part of our community. It's part of our culture. There are certain things you just don't do. There are certain ways you just don't act. It goes beyond the criminal code. We're not talking about, things that are illegal. We're talking about things that are indecent, inappropriate, outside the bounds of polite company. those sorts of things. And one of them, you would think, is not dancing on the grave of the recently dead, regardless of how you felt about it. I mean, earlier last hour, I brought up the fact that the Chicago Teachers Union is out there celebrating and honoring the life and legacy of Assata Shakur, who, you know, they apparently uplift as this champion, this revolutionary fighter, they call her, a fierce writer, revered elder of black liberation. Now, it just so happens she was also a convicted murderer of a New Jersey state trooper. She was also convicted of many other violent crimes. She was broken out of prison by leftist militants, smuggled to Cuba, and ended up on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. Now, what's the difference between me pointing that out now, because she just died, right? Am I displaying hypocrisy by pointing that out in the immediate aftermath of her passing? No. And the difference is, there's two differences. Again, going back to what I said earlier. Number one, my criticisms are accurate and true. Okay? It is a verified, documented fact that she murdered a police officer. She murdered a law enforcement officer. She was broken out of prison, smuggled to Cuba, and was on the FBI most wanted terrorist list. Those claims are categorically different than the absurd claims that have been made about Charlie Kirk. Number one. Number two, I'm not bringing this up like out of the blue. I'm not pointing out what kind of a person she was. I'm not going up to her daughter in her face and saying, your mom was a terrible person. What I'm doing is responding to the very profound reality that you have a teachers union in a major American city that is celebrating a terrorist. That's kind of relevant. That sort of matters. That's worthy of commenting upon. The same cannot be said about Charlie Kirk. You can call him a fascist. You can say he was a Nazi. You can say he was racist. You can tell all these lies about him that you want. But the difference is they're lies. Straight up. They're lies, and they're lies spoken for the intent of dishonoring a grieving family. 651-289-4488 is the number to join us if you feel so inclined. There is international news that is surfacing regarding the conflict in Gaza. This also from the Daily Wire. President Trump said on Friday that he thought Israel and Hamas were nearing a deal that could bring an end to the war in Gaza. Speaking to reporters outside the White House on Friday, Trump said, "It's looking like we have a deal on Gaza, and we'll let you know. I think it's a deal that will get the hostages back. It's going to be a deal that will end the war. It's going to be peace. I think we have a deal." Trump followed that with a post to his Truth Social platform where he said, "I'm pleased to report that we are having very inspired and productive discussions with the Middle Eastern community concerning Gaza. Intense negotiations have been going on for 4 days and will continue for as long as necessary in order to get a successfully completed agreement." And, you know, this has been something that's it's caused some fissures on both sides of the aisle. And the conversation, I mean, if you go on a deep dive online, you'll find these arguments amongst professed conservatives regarding how we should be thinking about the Israel-Gaza conflict. And it's a bit of a break from the traditional alignment on this issue, because traditionally Republicans, conservatives have been very strong backers of Israel, very strong defenders of Israel. And what you're hearing a lot of now is this undercurrent of skepticism about Israel, particularly as it relates to how they've handled Gaza. And listen, I will confess, I am by no means some storied, deep scholar on international affairs and the history of the Middle East or any of those things. But I can make basic moral judgments based on a few obvious facts. by virtue of the fact that, Donald Trump has to say here that the deal that they're approaching is to get the hostages back. Well, that's interesting. Hostages, you say? Which side again is holding hostages? I mean, generally speaking, I don't know. Generally speaking, if there's two groups of people, two sides to a conflict, and one of them is holding hostages, I think it's a pretty safe bet that that's the bad side, right? Like, I can't recall incidents in history where there was a group of people that were holding hostages who were the good guys. I mean, maybe I'm overlooking something. You can let me know. 651-289-4488. AM 1280, The Patriot, the Northern Alliance Radio Network. My name's Walter Hudson, sitting in for Brad Carlson. Find yourself stuck on the side of the road or slipping and sliding as you drive along? Well, it might be time to look into getting new tires. Check out TireGit.com. We're talking about a conservative-owned Minnesota business that provides top-notch customer service. They'll deliver your new tires to the vendor of your choice for installation and take care of you from beginning to end. Use promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, to get 3% off their already remarkable low prices. That's promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, at TireGit.com. Wouldn't have been my choice. I mean, the modern conveniences make it bearable, but boy, why anybody back in the day chose to live north of, like, I don't know, Mississippi or Missouri is beyond my understanding. 651-289-4488 is the number to call if you want to join the conversation. Been having a great chat about all these accusations of fascism that are being thrown around by the left against Republicans, just broadly, just categorically. We're all a bunch of fascists. We're all a bunch of Nazis. The majority of people who voted for Donald Trump in 2024, I guess, are just, card-carrying members of the Nazi Party. It's an astounding claim that should be regarded as categorically absurd on its face, and yet it is something that's being doubled down on and ran with by figures such as Governor Tim Walz, Governor Gavin Newsome, former President Barack Obama, and go down the list from there. They're just all on board with this narrative. It's astounding. It really is astounding to consider. But it raises the question of, like, what should our response be? What should our response be? Not beyond the argument of taking, like we've done the past hour or so, pointing out how absurd that argument is. Functionally, institutionally, how should we react? And I think there are multiple levels in answer to that question. One, of course, is what Trump is doing through his administration with sicking prosecutors and federal agents after the folks who are taking it to the next level, who are organizing to incite, materially support, or directly engage in violence. Those folks need to go to prison for decades. I mean, that's the top level response. And I don't care how many people are standing on the sidelines shouting about fascism and Nazis as it happens. Don't care. We're doing it. It's happening. We're prosecuting, we're defunding, we're dismantling. You don't get to organize violence in the United States of America. You just don't. But the other thing there's many other things that have to be done that go beyond criminal prosecution, the criminal code. One of them is our political response. Like, what do we do with the Democrat Party, which has clearly been infested with this toxic ideology? You've got people who take to the stage in front of microphones and cameras to say things like, we need to dismantle the United States. We need to dismantle our institutions. We need to decenter whiteness. We need to segregate classrooms. All right. What do we do with that? Now, there's a post that I just spotted online during the break, and I don't know who this guy is, but it's in response to Gavin Newsome declaring in all caps on X that Stephen Miller is a fascist. And the guy says, now they're trying to get another Tyler Robinson to go after Stephen Miller now. We need to end the Democrat Party. That's his prescription. We need to end the Democrat Party. Now listen, I understand the sentiment. I really do. But that's not the answer. It's not the answer for a couple of reasons. One, how you gonna? You gonna go from a two-party system to a one-party system? That ain't gonna work. But more fundamentally, we need, in order for our classical liberal order to persist, what we need is a restoration of order at all levels. And I don't just mean order in the sense of like law and order. Yes, of course we need that. But we need a restoration of an ordered conversation, an ordered dialogue. We need to restore what we used to call loyal opposition. That's how the minority party in any given scenario used to be referred to, as the loyal opposition, with an emphasis on loyal. Loyal to what? Well, loyal to the underlying project, loyal to the United States of America, loyal to the Constitution. And so what we need to do is not end the Democrat Party, but compel its restoration to what it once was, under, say, Hubert Humphrey or JFK, folks who agreed with us that America should be a thing, that the Constitution is sacred, that civil liberties are important, that civil rights should be pursued and upheld. That's what Democrats used to stand for an all too brief period of time in the last century. They don't stand for it now. And it is not a sustainable strategy to say, well, we're just going to keep defeating them and defeating them and defeating them and defeating them. Much as I would love to see that parallel universe where that gets to happen. That's not the answer. And frankly, it's not healthy. Right? Like if we had no viable, respectable, statesman-like opposition, we just had our own echo chamber, then we're not going to grow. We're not going to be challenged. We're not going to be pushed in the direction of liberty. Like right now, it's a tug of war. It's a tug of war between, we want to go toward liberty, they want to go away from it. But what we need is we need to have a new competition, a competition. It's actually not new. It's the restoration of the original competition, which is who's better at getting to liberty? Who's going to do a better job of affecting an environment where you can live your life according to your own values? Now, the first step in that and compelling that is to defeat them, right? Like in 2026, the Democrats just need to suffer a blistering, devastating decimation at the ballot box. Like they need to be in the midst of electoral ruin on election night of 2026, but not for its own sake, not so that we can, just stand up and gleefully cheer at their demise in the moment. The reason why that needs to happen is so that we can compel through that electoral defeat a reevaluation amongst those who remain on that side of what the hell have we been doing? How did this happen? What do we need to change? And at that moment of repentance, at that moment where they're willing to rethink how they've been operating, we need to sweep in and encourage and uplift leaders within their midst who are going to put the Democrat Party right. Let's go to Dan in Inver Grove Heights. Welcome to the program.
Yes, hi, Walter. God bless you for everything you're doing. Walter, I'm very concerned about something called Hawala money, Hawala, and that Governor Walz and the Democrats in power in Minnesota are unintentionally or unwittingly fueling just inordinate amounts of terrorism with all the fraud that a lot of Somalians are getting based on the names that we're seeing in these indictments. But we're not recovering this money, and if what people need to understand what Hawala money is, the meaning, transaction, and how it works. If you go to cleartax.in/s/Hawala-money, it explains it very well. basically, it's a way that people can transfer funds based on an honor system, and there's no tracking of it. So it's basically a way to fund terrorism. Settlements are made in a way that you just can't trace it. So it funds financial fraud, illegal activities. It's quite concerning to me, and I'm wondering if we have, ways to get intel on, how this method of banking, so to speak, is being utilized, and to stop it, because I think this is just extremely detrimental and devastating to our way of life.
I appreciate your comments, Dan. I'll speak to it offline. Appreciate you calling in. From Investopedia.com, Hawala is an ancient method of money transfer originating in South Asia. It enables the movement of funds without the physical transfer of currency. Known for its reliance on trust rather than official promissory notes, it operates outside traditional banking systems, particularly benefiting those in regions with limited access to formal financial networks. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a problem. And we'll talk more on the other side of the break about all this fraud and the implications of it. But where I'll land it for now is that rather than trying to mop up the mess on this side of the fraudulent transaction, we need to cut things off at the source. The Walz administration has already been forced to halt the Housing Stabilization Services Program, and they're continually, apparently there's continuing to stop payments and other programs to more and more providers on an almost daily basis, and that's great, but you need to turn off the faucet at the house, right? If you want to stop the flooding of fraud in this state, that's where it has to land. AM 1280 The Patriot. Walter Hudson in for Brad Carlson. Find yourself stuck on the side of the road or slipping and sliding as you drive along? Well, it might be time to look into getting new tires. Check out TireGit.com. We're talking about a conservative-owned Minnesota business that provides top-notch customer service. They'll deliver your new tires to the vendor of your choice for installation and take care of you from beginning to end. Use promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, to get 3% off their already remarkable low prices. That's promo code GRIT, G-R-I-T, at TireGit.com. Just totally drives it off the rails. And that's not what I wanted to talk about. Well, guess what? If you're behind this mic, you're a DJ at a wedding. It ain't about you. It ain't about what you want to hear. It's about what the audience wants to hear. And so your calls are welcome on any topic, 651-289-4488. During the break, I was perusing X, as is my wont, and I see this post from Gavin Newsome. Gavin Newsome has come up a lot today in our conversations because he is perhaps, I don't know, I mean, it is an Olympic competition for the most absurd Democrat. Even if you just narrow it down to the governors, it is quite the neck and neck to determine who's the most off the rails. But Gavin Newsome is definitely a contender, and he posted a screenshot from Grok where he asks the question of the AI, which party currently has control of the U.S. government? And of course it comes back with the answer of the Republican Party. And he posted that as a clapback against the White House, saying that the Democrat-led shutdown will put law enforcement lives on the line without pay. And so what Newsome is suggesting there is that, hey, you guys are in charge. You guys are in charge. See, I grokked it. The Republican Party is in charge of the federal government. So how can Democrats be the ones shutting down the government? Now, Gavin Newsome is either an idiot who doesn't understand basic civics and how the legislative process works in Washington, D.C., or he's hoping that you are. Because as he well knows or should know, there are like 53 Republicans in the Senate. Yeah, 53. 53-47 is the breakdown. In order for them to pass the continuing resolution, the Senate needs to have 60 votes. So that means 7 Democrats have to come along. So indeed, the only way the government shuts down is if those 7 Democrats can't be found, which means, objectively, if the federal government shuts down, it will be Democrats who are doing it. And Gavin Newsome knows this. It's tempting to think people are dumb. It's tempting to think that they just don't know what they're talking about. You don't get to be governor of the state of California without knowing how the legislative process in the U.S. Senate works. All right. That is something that a high school student knows. All right. So I'm being gracious to you, Governor Newsome. I'm being gracious to you by assuming that you're at least as smart as my 16-year-old. I'm being kind to assume that you're at least that smart, which means you're a liar. And that's significantly worse. Regarding the potential shutdown that we're potentially looking at here, this comes from Newsmax. Ahead of a meeting between lawmakers and President Donald Trump, the Republican leaders of Congress sought on Sunday to blame Democrats for an impasse prior to a looming deadline to pass legislation to avert a government shutdown and urged them to agree with a short-term bill to buy some time. Without passage of funding legislation, parts of the government would close on Wednesday, the first day the U.S. government's 2026 fiscal year. Republicans control both chambers of Congress, but a temporary measure keeping the government open would have to amass at least 60 votes in the 100-seat Senate, meaning some Democrat votes would be needed. Well, there you go. Gavin, you really only needed to get 2 paragraphs into this Newsmax story. I know you're probably not a frequent Newsmax listener, but what they're saying here is not privileged information. This is not an exclusive report. Newsmax is not breaking the news that you need 60 votes to pass a continuing resolution. This is information that is broadly available, that you have immediate and persistent access to. But you're out there tweeting that under the premise that that's not the case, that that's not true. What I find amusing about this whole thing is, for years and years and years, going back to the 90s, every time there's either been the threat of a government shutdown or the government has in fact shut down, it's always Republicans' fault. Always. The Democrats always regard it as Republicans' fault. The media always regards it as Republicans' fault. And some Republicans even regard it as Republicans' fault. And it's gotten to the point where, and I we had these conversations during the legislative session this year, because there were times when it didn't look like we were going to be able to land the plane. It's gotten to the point where it's almost like this kind of Stockholm syndrome that gets fostered amongst Republicans, where we're so scared of the accusation of being responsible for shutting down the government, because there's this belief, and it does bear out in terms of correlation with electoral outcomes, that whenever there's a shutdown, Republicans lose in the next election. But I think it's time to kind of rethink that, especially under these circumstances, because what we're supposed to believe in order for this narrative that Newsome and other Democrats are putting out there, former President Barack Obama had a post similar to this, less stupid, but similar in terms of its messaging, that it's Republicans, it's Trump who's going to shut the government down, even though every Republican has voted to keep it open, every Republican has voted to fund it, the bill's right there, all you got to do is pass it, and the votes that you're lacking all come from Democrats. Set that all aside. Somehow it's Republicans' fault. Apparently the way this works is, if Republicans are the ones who are in the minority and their votes are required in order to pass a budget, and the budget doesn't pass and the government shuts down, it's Republicans' fault. Also, if Democrats are in the minority and they're the ones whose votes are needed in order to pass a budget or a continuing resolution, and it doesn't happen and the government shuts down, that's also somehow Republicans' fault. So basically, just any time the government shuts down, no matter the circumstances, no matter the context, it's always us. We're always the reason. It's absurd on its face, and we don't have to accept it. We don't have to go along with it. We don't have to demur and kick the dirt and look down at our feet and apologize for doing our jobs. And, you know, the Democrats, if this is negotiated properly, like if we actually had command of our narrative, the Democrats are not in a good spot with this. I got to tell you, first of all, what is it that they're willing to shut the federal government down for? Taxpayer-funded health care for illegal immigrants. Last time I checked, that was not a red meat American issue that American voters are fired up about. Boy, I really, really want my money to go to illegal immigrant health care. That is not a popular issue. Even in this state, even in Minnesota, that's like an 80-20 against. Right? Like, people don't want their tax dollars going to pay for the health care of people who shouldn't even be here in the first place. So that's their issue. That's political landmine number one, is that they're doing this for something that isn't even popular. But then secondarily, by engaging in this kabuki theater, they're setting themselves up to inevitably be hated by their own side. So here's another piece from Newsmax. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has shown little interest in telling his Democrats and independents who caucus with them to do anything but obstruct Trump's agenda, with the GOP holding a 53-47 majority. Most standard legislation requires 60 votes to pass. There it is again. I don't know. Everybody seems to know this except Gavin Newsome. Most standard legislation requires 60 votes to pass the Senate under regular order. The online form gives activists a form to send to their senators under the banner, "Tell your Democrat senators to make sure Schumer doesn't hand Trump a blank check." Okay. Now, the blank check, by the way, is not blank at all, right? It's a continuing resolution that continues to fund the government at current levels for a couple of months. I don't. That's not how blank checks work. I hate to break it to you. You can spend this amount of money on these particular things for this amount of time. That doesn't seem very blank to me. So their messaging is a little warped there. Again, with the Democrats, it's always assume the people you're talking to are stupid. All their messaging, you go and you look at their narratives, you look at their sound bites, you look at how they frame issues, and it's always premised on something that is demonstrably untrue and is predicated upon, they're pushing their chips in the table on the expectation that the people they're talking to are idiots. But the other problem with this from a strategic perspective is you are going to hand Trump that blank check as you describe it. It's going to happen, right? I mean, we all know this. This isn't, why are we pretending that this is some sort of standoff? Yeah, maybe the government will be shut down for a few days, and you'll do your fundraisers, and you'll take to cable news, and you'll be on social media with your BS narratives, and you'll raise a bunch of money, and you'll establish your political narrative, and then you're going to come crawling back to D.C. and you're going to pass the continuing resolution. Well, what happens after that? What are you going to do when you go back to the activists who you're having send forms to their senators saying you better not do this? What are you going to tell them after you do it? Because you are going to do it, and we all know it, right? Like, you're not going to hold out for eternity in hopes of accomplishing something that's deeply unpopular with the American people. We all know that, like, let's not pretend. And so this entire strategy is just categorically absurd. But so that raises the question, why do they do it? Why do they do these stupid things that don't make any political sense, that are based on demonstrably untrue premises? Why do they do it? And the answer is because the Democrat Party, in its current formation, is utterly and completely hamstrung and controlled by radical socialists. That's why they are the ones being held hostage. Like to the extent that there are sane Democrats who know everything that I just said and know it to be true, there's nothing they can do about it. There's nothing they can say about it. They can't act upon their knowledge of what is real, because if they do, they're going to have their political heads, metaphorically, chopped off. And that's what they fear. 651-289-4488, AM 1280, The Patriot. My name's Walter Hudson, sitting in for Brad Carlson.
Let me tell ya, and it's a word that man can eat at all. When things are big that should be small, who can tell what magic spell?
The world today demands eternal vigilance. That's why we need to take care of our businesses, our families, our communities with security services. Integris Risk Solutions is a fantastic company that provides former law enforcement officers and former military personnel who are highly trained in order to provide the top-notch security services necessary for your business, your HOA, your school. They're adaptable to any situation. Check them out today.
Our agents receive extra training over, way and above the state minimum standards in order to be able to respond to any issues and be able to handle all situations.
Contact W. Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com or call 763-445-9482 to set up your free consultation today. That's 763-445-9482 or W. Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com. One of the most difficult things certainly for me, but I think probably for a lot of you too, over the past couple of weeks since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, to try and hold on to the light. You know, what is the positive here? Where's our hope? How are things going to get better going forward? And there is good news in that regard. If you, like me, watched the 5-6 hours worth of the memorial service for Charlie Kirk on Sunday, what we witnessed there was what I regard to be the largest tent revival that the world has ever seen. I mean, it was absolutely stunning. You had every single speaker, whether they were a personal friend of Charlie Kirk, an actual pastor, somebody who worked in the TPUSA organization, the Secretary of State, the Vice President of the United States, and indeed President Donald Trump himself. Each and every one of them was lifting up the name of Jesus Christ and preaching the gospel in whole cloth. Nothing held back, nothing ambiguous. Here it is. There was a literal altar call at this memorial last Sunday. And that was reflective. That was a larger example of something that A.K. Kamara, who's the RNC committee man here in the state of Minnesota, pointed out to me when the two of us were standing on a stage the Thursday prior in Lakeville at a vigil for Charlie Kirk, where we saw very much the same thing, where everybody was just getting up, preaching Christ. And there was a pastor, and there was an altar call, and people were giving their lives over. And AK turns to me and he says, you know, there are thousands of these events taking place right now across the world. If what's happening here is happening there, what is that going to do? What's the impact of that going to be on the culture? Not just in the United States, but globally. And there's an article at Breitbart that talks about this. Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills pastor Jack Hibbs told Fox and Friends First recently that people are asking his church for answers, the outlet reported on Sunday. People are coming to us, and they're saying, I want to know the meaning of life, the purpose, why am I here? The Fox report said people are calling the movement, the Charlie Kirk effect. And there's a tweet embedded here that says, the Charlie Kirk effect, faith leaders report a 15% rise in church attendance as young people inspired by Charlie Kirk turn to Christianity, with Bible sales surpassing 10 million through August of 2025. Kirk was fatally shot during a speaking event at Utah Valley University, and his murder sent shockwaves across the nation and the world, with many people mourning the Christian conservative and free speech advocate's death. In addition, Matt Zornson of Newman Ministry, which supports numerous campus ministries, said some schools have reported a 15% increase in young people attending Mass. The day after Kirk was killed, Hibbs said Kirk was a faithful witness for Jesus Christ and never hesitated to share the gospel with people, according to Breitbart News. He stated, I've had the honor of knowing Charlie Kirk well and personally for many years now. I cannot express how incredibly proud I've been of his faithful Christian witness and the way he has honored the Lord Jesus Christ with his life. Charlie was known as an intellectual giant, very compassionate young man, and one who was tirelessly devoted to the nation's welfare and our glorious republic. I'm humbled and blessed to have played a small role in Charlie's discipleship, and I know nothing was more important to Charlie than knowing Jesus Christ. Now, a couple things to note here. First of all, I think it would be overstating it. You know, when I talk about the fact that every single speaker last Sunday at the Kirk Memorial was preaching the gospel, do I presume that each and every one of those individual people are actually believers? That each and every one of them are actually born again and understand what it is that they're saying? I think that's probably unlikely. It's possible. But I'm sure there's a few strewn in there who are just mimicking what they're hearing around them, right? They're catching the moment. They're feeling the crowd, and so they're saying what is getting the applause lines. But even if that's the case, the fact that the market of ideas in this moment is compelling them to do that is pretty remarkable. And it is a turning point from what we have seen in the past. The entirety of my life, from the moment I was born up until now, there has seemingly been this drift toward the secular, this drift away from the Christian traditions of this nation, an excising, an exodus, if you will, an exile of Christianity from the public discourse. You know, you bring up the Bible and people's eyes roll. Certainly I've experienced that on the House floor here in Minnesota. Anytime any reference to Christ or the gospel or the Bible is made. And people get angry about it. Like they react with this kind of visceral disgust for you having the audacity to bring it up. But times they are a-changing. And my hope is, and my conviction is, that we speak more boldly, more fearlessly, with prayerful conviction, in order to effect the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations. Because that's the way, that's how self-government will be restored. Self-government is not something you deserve inherently. They gave you a republic if you can keep it, not because you deserve it. And the way you keep it is by governing yourself by the natural law, by the divine law. So that's the task before us. It's a hopeful one. And with his blessing on our lives, we'll be able to effect it. My name is Walter Hudson. It's been my honor to fill in for Brad Carlson here on AM 1280, The Patriot, Northern Alliance Radio Network. Take care.